it's much more complicated in some ways because you don't know who's the actual then decision maker on this. And what determines that is who actually controls the guns and who controls the money inside Hamas on the ground in Gaza, not those political offices outside, but it's those who actually have the power and who are holding the hostages. And I don't think anyone really knows where that's at.
Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, has been killed in Gaza after a strike by Israeli troops in the southern part of the area. The architect of the October the 7th attacks was believed to be hiding in tunnels beneath Gaza, but it appears he was discovered by chance in the upper floor of a half-demolished building, and that was by trainee troops who called in tank fire, unaware that they'd found Israel's most wanted man. And the confirmation of Sinwar's death was made earlier this evening after DNA tests were carried out on his body. Responding to the news, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to continue his country's war on Hamas until all remaining hostages were returned home.
I'm standing here today to tell you that he has been killed. He who killed and caused the worst massacre ever since the Holocaust. He was killed by our soldiers, our heroic soldiers. And we have finished our accounts with him. But the mission ahead of us has not been completed.
Well, let's talk to Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute. Brian, let's talk about what this means for Israel, Gaza and the wider region. But first of all, for Hamas, because this was the Svengali, this was the demonic architect as he's been presented, but they saw him as the chief resistance fighter. He was apparently also the key obstruction. He didn't want to do a deal. He didn't want to release the hostages. He wanted to fight on, and now he's gone. Let's discuss.
Yeah, this could be a very pivotal moment that could open the door to a ceasefire. But the question is, how much in disarray is the Hamas leadership and infrastructure? There's talk about his brother taking over, questions about whether this actually makes it easier or complicates actually getting to the end to the fighting and then the return of hostages. And I think given the fact that Israel does not clearly have a plan for the end state in Gaza and that it's in disarray right now, no order, it leaves me skeptical that it's going to be a turning point. Without that answer to the question of how does this end, coming from the Israeli standpoint and without the United States and others pressing them to do that, I fear you could see continued fighting and then others in the cadres of Hamas just stepping up because they're well armed, they've got tunnels, and they've got an ideology that says fight to the death.
Yeah, as one of our listeners has reminded us. But what about the two narratives emerging, Brian? Because on the one hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu saying this guy was running and hiding, we got him while he was trying to flee. But others are saying, hey, he was dressed in military fatigues. He was fighting. He wasn't hiding, surrounding himself by hostages or with hostages. He was out there leading the resistance. Which of those two narratives do you think is going to be more successful in the Strip itself?
It depends on the audience there, but in the Strip, I actually was just talking to a friend of mine who lives in Gaza. I worked with him more than 20 years ago, but we talk every few times a week, and he felt like the narrative that he's hearing on the street is that Sinwar is seen as a fighter and someone who is standing up for the Palestinian people. And this is
despite the fact that what he did on October the 7th last year has brought the most atrocious hell on the people of Gaza.
Yeah, this is just one guy's perspective. Yeah. I'm relating it. I'm not sure if it's the common perspective because there was, even before October 7th, if you want to look at a really interesting project, it's called Whispered in Gaza. People who gathered voices of people in Gaza who were discontent with Hamas before October 7th. So certainly that discontent had grown. I guess what my friend was essentially arguing was that this narrative that he was hiding in tunnels surrounded by old hostages was not the one in the end. And I don't think it's going to galvanize one way or the other attitudes in the Gaza Strip, which is your question, in part because people just want to see this end. They want to return to some sense of normalcy and stability. And that's why it's important, I think, for the United States, for European actors, and most importantly for the Israeli government to actually answer that question. How does this end? If this is a pivotal moment, we should utilize that. I'll remind folks that Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, and it took the United States 10 more years to get out of Afghanistan, right? And unless you have a clear game plan of how this ends, then you can end up finding these wars go on for a long time.
Yeah. And what about Vice President Harris, almost trying to create an Obama moment, standing there and giving leading the US response to the death of Sinwar, saying justice has been served. And this moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza. What do you make of the US almost trying to own this, quotes, Israeli success in killing the so-called mastermind, the architect?
It won't matter that much if it doesn't produce outcomes that create the conditions for a ceasefire and a hostage release. Americans, just certain constituencies, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, are focused on this, but those groups are about 2-3% of the electorate. Harris is 3 weeks before our elections here. She's clearly trying to claim credit. I don't think it's going to matter that much unless there's a much more significant outcome than the killing of this leader. And the significant outcome should be the things that she's talking about, but I'm not certain they're going to get there. And we're looking at, as Middle East watchers right now, another dynamic where Israel seems poised to conduct a massive strike on Iran, which creates all sorts of uncertainty. So here we are on a Thursday late, heading into a Friday, and the storyline could shift pretty rapidly just in the next few days. So I'm not certain it'll matter that much, either for the facts on the ground, but also because of the politics here as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Iran a moment or two ago, Brian. You can imagine what their response will be. But what about others in the Middle East, like Jordan, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia? How do you think they might respond to this? Might they put more pressure on those with the power to do something on the ground, including the Qataris who host the political office of Hamas?
Yeah, I think there'll be more talk about the end game amongst those actors too, and what to do with Hamas. And
I forgot to mention Egypt as well, of course. Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt's another clear actor. Look, all of these countries essentially for a year have been lobbying for a ceasefire, and they've all argued that with Sinwar and some of the leadership, if they're out of the scene, it might be easier to get there. Now's the moment to test that proposition. As I was saying before, I actually think it's much more complicated in some ways because you don't know who's the actual then decision maker on this, and what determines that is who actually controls the guns and who controls the money inside Hamas on the ground in Gaza. Not those political offices outside, but it's those who actually have the power and who are holding the hostages. And I don't think anyone really knows where that's at. But those Arab countries are key to actually getting to some sort of answer to that question of the end state, because they're the ones that are going to be expected to foot the bill, to offer some security support and things like this. But in this moment, we should use this moment to talk about how does this end and answer that question.
All right. Brian Katulis, thank you very much. Brian is a senior fellow
you.
for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute. It's Henry Bonsu on Times Radio.